Hello, this is Ken Stuzen. I'm a partner at Brown Advisory. Welcome again to the Now podcast. Now stands for navigating our world. Through these discussions, we try to better understand the world around us, to navigate some of the most pressing questions that are shaping our lives, our culture, and our investment challenges. As we look to the future, whether we agree or disagree with each other, the one thing we know for sure is that none of us can figure this out on our own. At Brown Advisory, we are focused on raising the future, and we hope these Now conversations will help us do just that.
You hear people talking about we should just stop producing oil and gas. That's a preposterous notion that you should stop producing oil and gas. The world would devolve into chaos and anarchy within a matter of weeks if that were to happen, if everybody just stopped producing oil and gas. But you get these dismissive views about oil and gas despite that. We're going to continue to need oil and gas for, we believe, and most people believe, decades still to come. So you can't just be that dismissive about the industry.
That's Steve Riney, the President and Chief Financial Officer at APA Corporation, the parent company of Apache Corporation, a large multinational oil and gas company. Steve's views on the energy industry have been informed by a career deeply embedded in all aspects of the industry. He's worked across exploration, production, operations, finance, M&A, and marketing at several corporations including Amoco, BP, and now Apache. As an operator and today as an executive, Steve has an important voice to consider as we seek to understand the future of the energy sources we rely on today and how we're all going to power our businesses, transportation, computers, and homes going forward. I'm Erika Pagel, a partner and portfolio manager at Brown Advisory. As we examine the move to a lower carbon economy during this Now series on the energy transition, I wanted to speak with someone like Steve, someone who leads a large oil and gas company, to get their perspective. In our previous episodes in this series, we've spoken with and learned a lot from experts across the energy landscape. We've discussed the role of renewables, including solar and nuclear, the impact of new technologies such as microinverters and small modular reactors, electric vehicles, new battery technology, the critical minerals on which electric vehicle batteries depend, and what it will take to get to net zero. The energy transition presents risks, opportunities, and has a lot of complexity. As investors, we believe it's essential to examine complex issues from many perspectives, so that we can understand, as fully as possible, the context in which we're investing our clients' capital. Steve's perspective from, as he says, an unapologetic oil and gas company provides important context in the long-term drive to a lower carbon future. I really appreciated Steve's views and his expertise. I started by asking him to describe Apache and its business.
Apache is what I call an unapologetic oil and gas company. We will produce oil and gas until the world doesn't need it anymore. And then if Apache is still in existence at that point in time, we will slowly and methodically go out of business as efficiently and as safely and as effectively as possible. But for now, the world needs abundant, reliable, and affordable energy. The world needs a lot more energy, not less. And oil and gas is just a great industry to be working in. Think about the human progress that we've made around the world in the last 150 years. And if you understood how oil and gas contributes to that, you'd understand we would be nowhere near where we are today without oil and gas. Apache has been in business for about 70 years now. We produce oil and gas and NGLs in the U.S., in the UK, North Sea, and in Egypt.
Steve mentions NGL. This is natural gas liquids. These are components of natural gas that are separated from the gas state in the form of liquids. They're used for manufacturing all kinds of plastics, rubber, detergents, refrigerants, and many other industrial and home uses.
And we explore in Suriname, Uruguay, Alaska, and in Egypt, and some what we call little E exploration in the onshore U.S. as well around the Permian Basin.
Steve, you've worked in the industry for a long time. You've talked about your experiences with working in the field, and now you're leading an oil and gas major. What would you say are the biggest differences today compared to 20 years ago in the energy industry?
In oil and gas, there have really been, in my view, three big areas of change over the last 20 years, as you say. The first one would be in technology. Technology is making a huge stride forward. Deepwater exploration and production 20 years ago was in its early stages. Gulf of Mexico here in the U.S. and offshore Brazil were probably the only areas at that point in time in the late 90s, early 2000s, where you had serious amounts of exploration and the beginning phases of development in what we would call deep water today. Today, deep water is the primary source of new sources of oil and gas for the world. Most onshore oil fields are mature and generally in decline, with the exception of maybe the Permian Basin. The second big technological advance was moving from conventional to unconventional production. Oil originates as carbon material in what we call the source rock. That's where the carbon material is actually buried millions of years ago, and that's where it's cooked back into oil, and then it begins to migrate up through the layers of sedimentation of rock, and it finds a different type of rock called a reservoir rock, which actually it's porous. It has pores in it, and the oil molecules can go in between the pores. Conventional production is where you explore for and produce gas out of reservoir rock. Unconventional production is where you're actually drilling into the original source rock and you're fracking that rock, you're fracturing it to stimulate the remaining amount of oil that hasn't already migrated out of that source rock to come into the wellbore and be produced over time. So that was the big breakthrough with the Permian Basin, was that you could go from a field that had produced billions of barrels in a conventional style, but also had unconventional opportunity as well. It's what's allowed the U.S. to be the producer that it is today. It also enabled continued delivery of affordable oil and gas, because at that point in time, as we were moving offshore, things were getting more and more expensive, and it was going to continue to get more expensive over time, requiring deeper or larger discoveries to make deep water production economical. Well, unconventional brought it back on shore again and made that economical, and it allowed us to continue to deliver affordable oil and gas to the world. The second big area of change over the last 20 years, I would say, is around sentiment towards the industry. The beliefs around the transition have actually created, in some corners, hostility toward oil and gas, whereas 20, 25 years ago, we just didn't have that. They're really dismissive views, and they're extremely uninformed, dismissive views about oil and gas today. The third area of change would be, I think, around financial discipline. 20 years ago, oil and gas, it was all about growth, even though at that point in time, we were already a mature global commodity growing about 1% to 2% a year in global demand, and yet for certain companies, it was all about growth, and that's what was differentiating one company for another. Today, growth has become a little bit of a four-letter word, and now it's about free cash flow, generating free cash flow, and returning to shareholders. And that's the way it should be for a mature industry. It should be one that's growing slowly. Most competitors in the industry should be targeting what we call low single-digit growth and returning a lot of free cash flow to shareholders, either in the form of dividends or in share buybacks.
Steve, in each of those three big changes that you just mentioned, you talked about both demand and production. And I've always been taught that the energy industry is reliant also on three areas: supply, demand, and geopolitics. How would you summarize the current outlook for the energy industry, and what does global oil and gas production look like today?
I think those are the three big drivers, and they're certainly the three big drivers that create a lot of volatility in oil price. Let's start with demand. If you look back to the 20-year period from 1999 to 2019, in 1999, the world was consuming 76 million barrels per day of oil. And by 2019, that was 98 million barrels per day. That's a growth rate over a 20-year period of about 1% to 2% a year, and it was pretty steady. There was a slight dip in 08 and 09 because of the financial crisis, and demand just fell apart during that time. But it was just a steady climb to 98 million barrels per day. Then you get to significant destruction of demand during COVID, and a little bit even trailing after COVID. So again, 2019, 98 million barrels per day of oil consumption. In 2020, that dipped to 89 million barrels per day. In 2022, it had grown back to 97 million barrels per day. Now we're actually back up on the pre-COVID trajectory. So in 2023, oil consumption was 102 million barrels per day around the world. So we're right back on the trajectory that we were on before. Most people realistically believe we're going to just continue on that trajectory for a while. On the supply side, in the short term, there's a lot of OPEC spare capacity today. OPEC is actually being pretty disciplined today at holding back production. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are actually holding back about 4 million barrels per day of potential production volume. For the longer term, if you look back from 2010 to 2014, oil price pretty much hovered in the $100 to $110 a barrel range. And then in 2015, just plummeted to $50 a barrel. And really, we've never fully recovered from that downturn in oil prices. We've been on a slow recovery in oil price since then. All of that lower price environment means less free cash flow for oil-producing companies, and that means less cash to reinvest in the business. In addition, some of the environmental and governmental forces are, today I would say working against oil and gas, and there's some good examples of that out there. And all of this is it's created an outcome where for the last several years, we've actually had less investment in future supply. And so I think for the longer term, if demand continues to grow at that old trajectory of 1% to 2% a year, we're going to come to a point in time when supply is going to struggle to keep up with it, because the amount of projects that were going on offshore for developing new resource offshore had slowed down quite a bit. And the world was used to these types of projects coming online, numerous projects coming online every year, bringing sometimes as much as 100,000, 200,000, even 300,000 barrels of oil a day. And we just haven't had nearly as many of those over the last several years for those reasons, driving down investment. And I think we're going to get to a point, most people think we'll get to a point where supply is going to struggle to keep up with the production demand. And some of that is probably because the Permian Basin, which made up for a lot of the missing big projects, big offshore projects, made up for some of that. The Permian Basin is, I'd be hesitant to say it's going to start declining anytime soon, really. But the growth rate on the Permian Basin has definitely slowed down.
Steve, maybe staying on that same topic, Apache recently announced the acquisition of Callon Petroleum, which ramps up your exposure to the Permian Basin. I'd love to just spend a little bit of time for our listeners who may not be familiar, but where is the Permian Basin? You just talked a little bit about the production out of that region. But maybe if you could just set the landscape of the major oil fields in the U.S. and the role that the Permian Basin plays and why it's so important to your growth at Apache.
Sure. So the Permian Basin is mostly in West Texas, a little bit in southeastern New Mexico. Permian Basin was originally discovered in the 1920s. It was discovered as a conventional oil field, so people drilling vertical wells into reservoir rock to produce the oil that was in it. So conventional production in the Permian peaked at about 2 million barrels a day in 1975 and then began declining. Unconventional production began in the Permian Basin somewhere in earnest at scale around 2010. Has now increased production from 2 million barrels a day at its prior peak to now over 6 million barrels per day. Total U.S. production, to put that in context, total U.S. production today is about 13 million barrels per day. So nearly half of it is coming from the Permian Basin. If the Permian Basin were a country, it would be the fourth largest producing country in the world. That's a pretty big basin. The cumulative oil produced out of the Permian Basin to date is a little over 40 billion barrels. That's the largest oil field in the U.S. If you compare that to other oil fields in the U.S. that are in production today, Permian Basin's 6 million barrels a day. The next two in size are the Bakken, which is in North Dakota, and the Eagle Ford mostly here in Texas. Those each produce about 1.2 million barrels per day, so a fraction of the size, each of them 1/5 the size of the Permian Basin. If you look at the other large U.S. oil fields in terms of cumulative production, again, the Permian was a little over 40 billion barrels produced to date. The Gulf of Mexico has produced 27 billion barrels. Alaska, Prudhoe Bay, mostly in Alaska, has produced about 20 billion barrels. And then you go down to the Bakken in North Dakota that's produced about 12 billion barrels. So the Permian is a huge oil field, both historically in the conventional sense and today in an unconventional sense.
Steve, what are the opportunities in natural gas versus oil going forward?
There's a lot of opportunity in natural gas in the U.S. We've got one of the lowest gas prices in the world right now. The issue is that low gas price, absent export of LNG to the rest of the world.
LNG is liquefied natural gas. This is a hyper-cooled state, which allows natural gas to be stored and shipped around the world. LNG is typically 85 to 95% methane, which contains less carbon than other forms of fossil fuels.
The economics of drilling for more natural gas in the U.S., the price of natural gas in the U.S. just doesn't support it. There's a lot of natural gas to be produced from Utica Shale, Marcellus Shale, the Haynesville Shale. The Permian Basin has a lot of gas. There's a lot of gas around the U.S., but a gas price of $2 to $3 an MCF doesn't support more drilling for natural gas to supply the U.S.
MCF. This is the measurement unit for natural gas, which equates to 1,000 cubic feet.
It does make for an attractive economic return for drilling for natural gas in the U.S. to liquefy it, put it on a boat, and ship it to Asia or to Europe. You can sell an MCF of natural gas here in the U.S. today for about $2. It'll sell in Europe for about $10.
You have operations in not only the U.S., but internationally. What are the opportunities and challenges of being an energy supplier on an international basis today?
We have chosen to be a multinational company. So there are challenges associated with that, but we think the opportunities outweigh those challenges. The U.S. is dominated by the Permian Basin, and the Permian Basin, at least until today, because things are changing in the Permian Basin, but the Permian Basin the last 5 to 10 years has been dominated by what we'd call the Permian pure plays. And comparing those to a multinational type of company like ourselves, I'd say the challenges are the complexity, and it's complexity both inside and outside. It's challenging for Apache because you've got different modes of taxation, different types of regulation, different types of government interactions, and you have to be adept at all of those in every country that you operate in. It's also challenging for investors because investors, they love the Permian pure play model because it's the thing about the Permian, because it's unconventional, it's repeatable over acreage that they own. So the spreadsheet modeling of a Permian pure play doesn't have a lot of complexity to it. It's more predictable. And so the modeling of a company like Apache for investors is a bit more difficult, but there are opportunities. There are good things about being a multinational company. The first one I would highlight would be the diversification benefit of that. We have the ability to move capital around our portfolio. We're not just a Permian pure play. We're not just drilling wells in the Permian. A good example of that came up over the last couple of years where we have moved a lot of drilling capital out of the North Sea because of the taxation that the UK government decided to put on North Sea operators. And that capital moved into Egypt, and some of it moved back into the Permian Basin. So when things happen in your portfolio, you have the ability to adjust and to move capital around. The other thing is that for the future, it brings about degrees of freedom that you otherwise wouldn't have. We just did an acquisition in the Permian Basin with Callan, but we could also, just as equally as we have done in the past, we could do acquisitions in West Africa, in North Africa, or any other foreign country because we feel comfortable engaging in operations, doing acquisitions in foreign countries. And it would be much more difficult for somebody who's a Permian pure play today to go and decide, okay, I want to start drilling in offshore West Africa. So there are benefits to having that diversified portfolio.
Steve, this podcast series has been focused on tackling challenges and opportunities with the energy transition. What does energy transition mean to you and Apache?
Yeah, so I would say at this point, we don't really see an energy transition happening. And I don't mean to make light of the notion of a transition. Renewable energy sources are growing. There's no doubt about that. But as I laid out earlier, oil and gas demand is also still growing. And some, ourselves included, perhaps many, believe that oil and gas demand will continue growing for quite some time. I think the whole notion of calling it a transition is actually a bit misleading, and it actually might miss the mark of the purpose. Because what we actually see happening is an energy expansion, and we believe that's a good thing. The world needs more energy, not less. Energy poverty is still real, and it's still with us. Today, 10% of the world still has no access to electricity. If you have access to electricity, that's defined as at least 4 hours per day. So some people would say only 10% of the world doesn't have access. We've made great progress because not too many years ago it was 20 and 25%. Energy or electricity for at least 4 hours a day is a low hurdle. How many people have reliable access to electricity? 40% of the world does not have reliable access to electricity. And reliable is defined as no more than 1 hour a day without electricity. And that might be extreme to the other side, but if you just put those two together, somewhere between 10% and 40% of the world is living with electricity somewhere between 4 hours and 23 hours for the day. And that's still a huge number of people. 1/3 of the world today lacks clean cooking fuels, which is a source of most indoor air pollution and has a significant impact on life expectancy. And most of that is with women and young girls and children. So hopefully we're in what we refer to as an energy expansion, not a transition necessarily, at least not in the short term. And hopefully we're going to continue in that regard. We at Apache, we are all for renewable forms of energy. We have no argument against any of those. We're not going to invest in those because that's not our area of expertise. But we do recognize the expertise that other people have. We respect that, and we believe the world needs every form of energy and needs more of every one of them. And we believe we should be growing every form of energy as well.
Can you give some specific examples of what cleaner oil and gas production looks like, and maybe spend a little bit of time talking about the benefits from an environmental standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint?
So we made a promise in 2021 that we were going to reduce what we call routine flaring. Routine flaring is anytime you're flaring gas, which in the Permian Basin is about producing oil. It produces lots of natural gas as well. A lot of that natural gas over the many years has been flared because it's not economic to collect that gas, gather it, compress it, and get it into a sales pipeline for somebody to burn it for a commercial or residential reason. So that's routine flaring, where you're just burning off the natural gas that a well might produce in order to produce the oil. And in 2021, we made the commitment that we were going to eliminate routine flaring. The routine, day-to-day flaring, not just Permian Basin, but all onshore U.S. Routine flaring. We promised to do it by the end of 21. We did it by the end of September in 2021. Egypt, similar to the Permian Basin, Egypt has a number of areas in the Western Desert that's just primarily oil field production, but has associated gas. And at a number of the oil plants, we were just flaring natural gas. In 2022 and even into 23 a bit, we began making the investments to capture the gas, to compress it, and get it into sales lines and stop flaring that pretty significant amount of gas in Egypt. Another thing that we did in the Permian Basin is we're in the process. We've made great strides on this in 2023. We're eliminating pneumatic devices that are actuated by methane. The easiest thing to do on an oil well is if you have a pneumatic device that, for example, needs to start up a pump to pump water off of the well so it can produce more oil. The easiest thing to do is let's just use the natural gas that's coming out of that well. We can actuate the pneumatic device with a puff of methane gas. That obviously emits methane into the atmosphere. That's a common practice that's been done in the Permian Basin for many years. We started in 2023. We committed to eliminating at least 2,000 pneumatic devices. We eliminated quite a bit more than that, and we're still eliminating more pneumatic devices in the Permian Basin in an effort to reduce our methane emissions. Also in the Permian, we're using a lot less fresh water to frack our wells now. We take the water that comes back off of that, we capture it, we recycle it, and reuse it for our fracks instead of using fresh water, which was a common practice in the past. And then finally, we're returning, just not necessarily emissions related, but environmental related. We're returning a lot of old plugged and abandoned sites to their natural state that they were in before we even showed up. And we've been doing that to a number of sites out in the Permian Basin for the last year. I don't want to give the wrong impression that we weren't doing all of this before. This isn't necessarily new to Apache, but we're talking more about it. In 2021, we promised to eliminate 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions by the end of 2024. Now, at that time, that was over 15% of our total worldwide CO2 equivalent emissions. And we were going to eliminate that in 3 years. And we've done this. We will accomplish that by the end of this year. We will actually exceed the 1 million tons. And that's been done everywhere we operate. It's been done in the U.S., it's been done in Egypt, it's been done in the North Sea. And I would say on the financial side, I would just say there's a mix of financial costs and financial benefits. It's probably pretty marginal in the grand scheme of things. But They're the types of things that are the right things to do. It's part of the cost of doing business today.
Steve, how do you think about an energy source tipping point when consumers make that switch to renewables, and what will Apache do in that situation?
So I think a tipping point usually requires two things. It requires some significant technological breakthrough, and then it requires a capacity to fund adoption fairly quickly. And energy, especially oil and gas, doesn't actually lend itself to those types of things. So in oil and gas, technology evolves. You don't typically get these major breakthroughs. They're not nearly as likely. An example is that in the chip industry, you've got Moore's Law working for you. Every 2 years, you get 10 times the number of transistors in the same space on a microchip. That doesn't apply in energy. You think about batteries. When I was 5 years old and got toys for Christmas, they came with these batteries that you could buy at the drugstore. And many years later, I buy toys for my grandchildren, and they come with batteries, and lo and behold, they're the exact same batteries. And they do last a little bit longer. Some of them are rechargeable. And in the whole world of energy, it's the laws of physics that apply more than a Moore's Law type of situation. The other thing about the capacity to fund an adoption, there is a huge amount of infrastructure required to deliver energy of all sources. And that infrastructure and the sunk cost in infrastructure and the time frame for rebuilding that or re-equipping that will slow adoption significantly. A great example of that is charging stations for electric vehicles. We've been talking about a nationwide grid of charging stations for many years. We still haven't gotten there. There's a huge amount of infrastructure investment that has to be made, and that will naturally slow the adoption process. So I'm not sure the whole tipping point analogy actually applies. I think this is going to be a long, gradual process. I'm not trying to deny that a transition is going to occur, that renewables aren't going to grow and take a larger chunk of the energy market. It's just that it's not going to reach a point where it just tips over and accelerates to owning the market.
Steve, I'd like to ask one more question. When did you first start thinking about sustainability? And how did these focus areas start to influence what you were doing at Apache?
I think the recent ESG movement really took off in the last 10 years. And like any good thing, more must be better. And so we suddenly found ourselves with shareholder proposals, ESG activism, ESG investment vehicles, and the oil and gas industry was inundated with demands about net zero emissions disclosures, scope 3 emissions, and when are you going to get into renewables investments. We've taken the more pragmatic approach. We don't make any promises to deliver net zero. We think scope 3 is fraught with overcounting. We just err on the side of let's just do the things that make a difference today and we'll learn as we go. But somewhere along the way, things just went off the rails with ESG. There's fundamentally nothing wrong. Everything is good with ESG. It's the right thing to be doing. But it became like this lightning rod for the extremist views on both ends. On one extreme, ESG was hijacked by people to browbeat companies into doing things that they didn't want to do and really shouldn't be doing. And then the other end of the spectrum, the other extreme of the spectrum, used that as an excuse to, now look what they're doing with ESG. ESG has become a 4-letter word. And now we're just going to call for the end of the ESG movement. And we just don't think either one of the extreme notions of this is right. We'll figure out maybe what we need to call it instead of ESG. But we're going to keep doing the things that we know are right. We're going to keep doing things to keep our people safe, to invest in the communities that we work in, and to reduce emissions, producing oil and gas that the world needs, what we need to do to help eliminate energy poverty, which does exist today and exists in pretty large numbers. And we're going to keep doing that in as emissions-friendly a way as possible, and we're going to keep getting better and better at that. And if everybody else in our industry would do that, we'll probably get to a pretty good place.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us today and being our guest. I learned a lot about the energy industry's perspective and hope our listeners did as well.
Thank you, Erika. It was great being here with you.
Thank you for joining our Now conversation. We're going to take a break from our recent focus on the energy transition and turn to geopolitics as we gear up for our Now conference in San Francisco in a few weeks. The purpose of our Now conference is to come together with clients and friends of the firm, to take time to think and to connect, with the goal of gaining a deeper understanding of the issues that are shaping the world in which we live, raise our families, contribute to society, and yes, invest. We'll explore the power dynamics that are driving our world today, and then examine how businesses, innovators, and community leaders can forge solutions to thrive and raise the future. To lay the foundation for these conversations, our next podcast episode will focus on the geopolitical landscape. My colleague and partner Meredith Etherington will chat with Sir Robin Niblett, one of the foremost experts on U.S. and European foreign policy. Robin will help us make sense of the precarious balance between global risks and opportunities, and in particular, how the contest between the United States and China will shape our world. There will be a lot to talk about and a lot of nuance to understand. I cannot think of a better guide than Robin. We hope you'll tune in. Until then, be well and stay safe.